BGE Close Reading, Pete Smeaton. You are about to hear a section from a novel called Think Me Back by Catherine Ford. Listen carefully and follow along with the text if possible. When he first woke up, Pete Smeaton was sure he was still dreaming. Then he opened his eyes and knew that it had really happened. He was lying in a sleeping bag on the floor of a room in his new home, a home he had never set eyes on before. And Jenny was crying. At least some things never changed. Pete sat up stiffly and looked around. Whatever room he was in was furnished with nothing but packing cartons, stacked one on top of the other. He couldn't tell if the room was large or small because all he could see were boxes, labelled in his mother's hasty scrawl. Kitchen, my room, hall, Pete, Jenny. He remembered the hurried squeak of the marker pen on the boxes as the carrier waited to transport them up from London. That was just yesterday. Even muffled by packing cartons, Jenny's cry was shrill and piercing. Pete groaned and flopped back in his sleeping bag. He closed his eyes and put his hands over his ears. The crying grew louder. Pete opened one eye as Jenny was shoved into his arms. "Take her, will you, so I can at least go to the toilet on my own. If I put her down, she'll be sick. This new place has given her the heebie-jeebies. She was up all night." Pete's mother left him with the hot, open-mouthed bundle that was his baby sister. 3 months old and more hassle than 20 Petes had ever been, according to Mrs. Smeaton. Pete stared into the tiny, furious face. "Hello, Noisy," he said slowly. Secretly, he loved the feeling of Jenny when he held her, although he would never admit that out loud to anyone. No way. Hearing Pete's voice, Jenny stopped crying instantly. Pete felt her body relax in his arms. "Why do you always stop crying for me, you little monkey?" Pete whispered on Jenny's downy head. "You should give Mum a break." Fitting Jenny expertly in the crook of one arm, Pete levered himself up from the floor. "Come on, let's see what this place is like, Jenny. Time to explore." The floorboards felt rough and chilly under Pete's feet. Snuggling Jenny close, he went out into the hallway. Must have slept in the lounge, Pete figured. He was downstairs, and the only other room on this floor was a large square kitchen with a small scullery. Beyond lay a wild-looking garden. "It's a jungle out there, Jenny," said Pete in an American accent. "Better wait till armed before I investigate." Upstairs on the half landing of the house there was a bathroom and one huge empty bedroom. The morning sun streamed through its emptiness, illuminating the specks of dust which danced in such numbers that the room appeared in soft focus. Pete stood in the centre of this room and knew that he wanted it to be his. It was easily 3 times the size of his old bedroom in London. Quickly he planned where he would put his books and lean his guitar. His bed would fit perfectly in that corner over there, and if his desk fitted under the window, he'd be able to look outside and daydream while he was supposed to be doing his homework. There'd be enough room for all his friends to stay overnight if they brought their sleeping bags. "We could have a midnight feast and make up all those songs that drive Mum mad and—" Pete was whispering excitedly to Jenny. Then he remembered where he was now. "What an idiot. What friends," he said bitterly to Jenny. "Don't know anyone here, do I? Never even heard of Clydebank before in my life. Don't even know what bloomin' school I'll be going to." Pete stared into Jenny's blue, unblinking eyes. "You're lucky. Bet we'll be back in London by the time you need any friends. How am I going to meet anyone here?" Pete leaned his forehead despondently on the glass and stared down at the garden. It really did look like a jungle. An expanse of unruly grasses weaved before Pete, reaching down to a ramshackle brick outbuilding. Beyond that, the boundary of the garden was drawn by a row of mature trees and bushes. "It's huge," thought Pete, who had never lived in a house with a garden before. He had to admit, grudgingly, that this garden looked big enough for a decent game of football. It was his birthday next week. Maybe he'd ask for goalposts instead of that portable CD player he had his eye on. Pete gazed out of the window and saw himself running out onto the grass, heading a crowd of boys. Good pass, Pete. Here, over to me, Pete. Yeah, nice one, Pete. Pete, 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 where on earth have you gone? Mrs. Smeaton's irritation interrupted his daydream. What are you doing with her now? It's all dusty up here. She shuddered. Ugh, chilly. Mrs. Smeaton yanked Jenny from Pete's arms. She was asleep, a smug little smile playing over her lips. Now look what you've done. Mrs. Smeaton's voice rose in frustration. I wanted to feed her first. Pete shrugged. Sorry, Mum. She was awake 2 minutes ago, honest. He was going to add, got the magic touch, haven't I? But something about his mum's pinched face and tired, shaky voice made him stop. She looked as though she was going to start crying again. He really hated that. Never could get used to it, even though she cried all the time these days. Her tears made Pete feel panicky and scared. Quickly he asked, Mum, can I have this room if you and Dad don't want it? Do what you like, snapped the answer. Won't make any difference to me. I don't sleep these days with this one yammering all the time. Someone in this family might as well use one of the bedrooms to get some rest. The bitterness in his mother's voice made Pete wince. He stood at the door of his new room, watching her slump wearily downstairs with Jenny in her arms. There was a horrible, tight feeling inside his chest. By the time Mrs. Smeaton had reached the bottom stair, Jenny was wailing. Oh, for goodness sake, Pete heard his mother sigh as she carried Jenny through to the kitchen, slamming the door behind her so hard that the whole house shook. Then the wailing became louder, and louder still. It turned into sobbing, huge, uncontrollable sobbing. Pete stood with his hand on the doorknob and listened. Mum? Pete was more taken aback by the power of the crying than by the crying itself. Surely it wasn't Jenny. It was much too powerful. Whoever was crying was much closer than the kitchen downstairs, and it sounded like a child, right next to Pete. You've now heard the entire passage. Now go on and complete the questions uploaded by your teacher. Remember, you can play this passage or this video again as many times as you need to. Good luck.